I don't expect you to read that. And you don't need to, because the text of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom is to be found in your programs. 3 chairs. Unless something is planned about which I know nothing, and that is entirely possible, those chairs will not be occupied. So, what are they doing there? Perhaps creating an atmosphere of coziness and friendliness, which is certainly an atmosphere which we covet. Good evening, and a warm welcome to you. CPR. The Department of Classics, Philosophy, and Religion, affectionately known as cardiopulmonary resuscitation, at the very heart of a liberal arts education. CPR is pleased to welcome you to this continuing annual celebration of Thomas Jefferson's Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom. Our celebrations began in this form in 2002, and they have continued with, we think, a growing sense of the significance of that which they celebrate. Religious freedom is dialectical. Freedom for religion entails freedom from religion and vice versa. Among the members of CPR who have heartily supported this celebration, moderating last year's program right here, and introducing tonight's speaker is Professor of Religion Mary Beth Matthews.
Thank you. I'll be brief. Welcome to the University of Mary Washington's annual celebration of the Thomas Jefferson Statute for Religious Freedom. This statute, which David noted for you, is printed in your program and was a model not just for religious toleration, but religious liberty here in Virginia, and it served as a model for the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. I'm pleased to inform you that tonight we have an expert in early American history to discuss his recent scholarship on America's national origins and its religious views. John Fea is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of History at Messiah College in Grantham, Pennsylvania. He holds the PhD from SUNY Stony Brook, and he is the author of 2 books, The Way of Improvement Leads Home, Philip Vickers' Fithian and the Rural Enlightenment in Early America, and the book which shares its title with today's talk, Was America Founded as a Christian Nation? A Historical Introduction. Here's where I'm going to put in a plug. It's available on Amazon and it costs less than $20, so rush out and order a copy after the talk tonight. He's also co-edited a collection of essays, Confessing History, Exploration in Christian Faith, and the Historian's Vocation. Professor Fea is part of a growing number of scholars in American history and American religious history who seek to connect the sacred and the profane, the religious history and the secular history of our country. In so doing, Dr. Fea makes important observations about both the history of the founding of the United States, as well as the historiography of that subject. For those of you who are not historians, historiography is quite simply the way of doing history, the way we interpret and write about history. As Professor Fea makes clear, his goal is to make sense of the American past and its relationship to Christianity. Please join me in welcoming Dr. John Fea.
Good evening. I feel like this is the Academy Awards or something. I'm called out from behind the curtain. It's good to be here at the University of Mary Washington. Thank you to the CPR department for hosting me, for Mary Beth and Craig Vasey, who have been great hosts. I've been here only about 4 or 5 hours, but I feel like I've been here a couple days. The reception has been so great. So thank you, and it's good to be with you. I think this is maybe first time on campus here, but I think I've been to Fredericksburg a couple times, maybe something related to the Civil War, or something like that. So I'm not here to talk about the Civil War today, though. I'd like to actually start with a story. And it's a story that's included in the book that Mary Beth just mentioned. It's a story about Jamestown, which is at least nearby. During the week of June 11th, 2007, 4,000 Christians converged on Williamsburg, Virginia, to celebrate the 400th anniversary of the founding of Jamestown, the first successful English colony in North America. The event was sponsored by an organization called Vision Forum Ministries, an organization that, among other things, is committed to teaching history as the providence of God. The Jamestown Quadricentennial, a celebration of America's providential history, that was the title of this event, was a gala one. For the cost of admission, visitors were treated to lectures on various themes in early American history, historical reenactments, faith and freedom tours of Williamsburg and Yorktown, and hot air balloon rides over the sites of the Jamestown settlement. One of the highlights of the week was a children's parade, led by a Pocahontas reenactor. 1,000 boys and girls dressed in period clothing marched in a 1-mile procession to commemorate the planting of this historic colony. The week came to an end for these American Christian pilgrims with a Sunday morning worship service. Now, the Vision Forum gathering differed markedly from the celebration planned by the national government and its Jamestown 400th Commemoration Commission. While both events featured activities for families and an array of educational opportunities, the government-sponsored commemoration did not include lectures and seminars with titles such as Jamestown's Legacy of Christ, Liberty and Common Law, or this title, Refuting the Revisionists on America's 400th Birthday. Nor did the brochures advertising various tours of Jamestown read like the one being promoted by a popular Christian radio host and theologian, which read, "Join Gary DeMar as he presents well-documented fact which will change your perspective about what it means to be a Christian in America." If you are tired of the revisionism of the politically correct crowd trying to whitewash our Christian history, you will not want to miss this tour. The Providential Historians Quadricentennial was part of an attempt by some evangelicals to reclaim what they believe to be America's Christian heritage. They have made the relationship between religion and the creation of the American Republic a dominant theme in the ongoing culture wars. Many well-meaning Christians, like those associated with the Vision Forum, believe that America was founded as a uniquely Christian nation. These evangelicals have used this historical claim to justify policy on a host of moral and cultural issues facing the United States today. The study of the past, they argue, has been held hostage by secularists who have rejected the notion that the American founders sought to forge a country that was Christian. Instead, these revisionists wrongly claim that the American Revolutionary era was informed by Enlightenment ideals about toleration and about pluralism. In their attempt to counter these arguments, some believers in a Christian America have supported House Resolution 888, not to be confused with Herman Cain's 999. This is House Resolution 888, an attempt by Christian lawmakers in Congress to establish an American Religious History Week that celebrates the rich spiritual and religious history of our nation's founding. Others have taken control of the Texas State Board of Education in an attempt to change the state's social studies curriculum to better represent the Christian themes that they believe all Christian or all school children should study and learn. Still others take their historical marching orders from David Barton, a Texas preacher who writes books and conducts tours designed to promote America's supposed Christian heritage. GOP presidential candidate Newt Gingrich and former candidates Michelle Bachmann and Rick Perry have supported Barton's claims. So, was America founded as a Christian nation? In my experience, I have found that many average citizens are confused about this topic. Unfortunately, those who dominate our public discourse tend to make matters worse. For example, during the 2008 presidential campaign, Republican candidate John McCain announced that the Constitution established the United States of America as a Christian nation. But the Constitution, if read carefully, says nothing about the relationship between Christianity and the United States. Former Arkansas governor and fellow presidential candidate in 2008, Mike Huckabee, said on the campaign trail that most of the 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence were clergymen. In fact, only one member of the clergy signed the Declaration, College of New Jersey President John Witherspoon. We live in a media culture that makes it difficult to have any sustained dialogue on these historical issues. It's easy for those who argue that America is a Christian nation, and for those who do not, to appear on radio or television programs, quote from one of the founders or one of the nation's founding documents, and sway people to their positions. These kinds of arguments, which can often be contentious, do nothing to help us unravel a very complicated historical puzzle about the relationship between Christianity and the American founding. So I ask again, was America founded as a Christian nation? When I speak on this subject, I have found that most people come to my lecture with their minds already made up, yes or no, and they expect me to provide historical evidence to confirm their position in one way or another. What is a historian to do? If there is one thing that a historian should not do, it is to jump into the political debate. In some ways, the question in the title of my current book and the title of this lecture, was America founded as a Christian nation, I would argue is a bad historical question. How about that? An author admitting that the title of his book is a bad one. It is not a question that lends itself to easy yes or no answers. It's not a title that connects at all with the way people are looking to answer this question in our public discourse. My goal in this lecture, then, is not to lay out a case for or against a Christian founding, because I believe that the answer to the question depends on how you define one's terms. What do we mean by Christian? When was the United States founded? Or when did the United States become a nation? In the field of religious studies, in the field of theology, in the field of early American history, all of these definitions are contested ones. That means that historians and theologians and religious scholars and other pundits debate over what a Christian is, or what a nation is, or when the United States was founded or actually became a nation. These are all very complicated issues. What I would like to do in this lecture is offer 6 things to think about as we approach this thorny topic, and try to make sense of the relationship between religion and the American founding. Let me start, my first point, let me start by suggesting that America has always seen itself or understood itself as a Christian nation. Now, when I say this, I am not suggesting that people who believed that they were living in a Christian nation were right or wrong. I'm not suggesting that they interpreted the founding generation correctly or incorrectly. What I mean by that is the founding generation's view on the relationship between church and state. What I am suggesting as a historian is that the overwhelming majority of Americans from roughly 1789 to the 1950s believed that they were living in one form or another, however they defined it, living in a Christian nation. Let me give you some examples, or at least one significant example, which I think is appropriate here in Fredericksburg, and especially appropriate here as we're also in the year celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. And then we'll get back to the founding era in a second. both the Confederacy and the Union believed that they were Christian nations. They believed that they were fighting a cause, they were supporting the cause of God. Some of you familiar with the second inaugural address of Abraham Lincoln knows that Lincoln was very aware of this as well, as he said both sides pray to the same God. The North believed that they were a Christian nation because they believed that the Union was indestructible, that it was sacred in some ways, that God had uniquely blessed the United States of America. The Constitution was the sacred model of this unity. And as a result, anybody who would challenge this kind of unity, this kind of sacred God-given unity, would be essentially opposing the divine, sinning in the minds of some of these northern ministers who often talked about this. How can you have a secession from the Union because, this has to be against God because God is certainly in favor of nationalism. Now, of course, you can also think about slavery. The North did not condone the institution of slavery. The South did. So that's another argument for why God might have been on the northern side. But the Confederacy made similar arguments about their Christian identity. Let me read to you the preamble to the Confederate Constitution of the United States of America. And listen to it carefully. Those of you who know the preamble to the United States Constitution will recognize some of the wording and terminology here. But of course, listen carefully, and I'll emphasize, I'll inflect my voice for emphasis here. We, the people of the Confederate States, each state acting in its sovereign and independent character in order to form a more permanent and federal government, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, and serve the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, invoking the favor of and guidance of Almighty God, do ordain and establish this Constitution. Now, if you recite the United States Constitution, if you know it by memory, you know that the Confederacy added into that preamble a reference to the Almighty God. If you read the United States Constitution carefully enough, with the exception of at the end, where it's signed in the year of our Lord 1787, which, by the way, was probably written by a clerk after the convention had already left and gone back to their homes, there is no mention in the United States Constitution of God. There are mentions of religion, which we'll get to here in a second, but there's no mention there of God. Well, says the Confederacy, how can you claim that you are a Christian nation and you are doing God's will, you Northerners, when you don't even reference the Almighty in your Constitution? Our Constitution, as one New Orleans minister said, is a Christian patriot's prayer. This bothers so many people in the North, especially Northern clergy, that immediately after the Civil War, there's a fairly significant movement called the National Reform Association. This is the NRA, before the NRA. Their whole purpose, they're so embarrassed by what the Confederates are accusing them of, their entire purpose is to get a Christian amendment tacked onto the United States Constitution, which specifically says that the United States of America is a Christian nation. Because after all, a nation that honors God, that is a truly Christian nation, will recognize God in its Constitution. And in fact, one of the reasons in the 1780s why there were many who rejected the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists, as they were known, for some of you who studied American history, one of the primary reasons that they rejected the Constitution, not the primary reason, but one of them, was that the Constitution did not reference God. How can we have a government that does not reference God in its most important document? The point being here is both the Confederacy and the Union believed that they were Christian nations. And what I try to do early in my book is I try to trace this history. Whether it be evangelical Protestants claiming that the United States is a Christian nation, whether it be Catholics, or whether it be liberal Protestants. The social gospelers in the early 19th century, liberal Protestants who wanted to change the world and bring about the kingdom of God through acts of social justice. People like Washington Gladden and Walter Rauschenbusch. These men, if you read their rhetoric carefully enough, they believe that we must solve the ills, the social problems of our society, because if we do, not only will Jesus Christ return, but America will be Christian in its identity. So this is not something that's normally, that's exclusively associated with evangelicals throughout American history, although many times it is, particularly in the early 19th century, when through a massive revival known as the Second Great Awakening, the culture of early 19th century America is very much saturated with evangelicalism. So my first point, America has always been, or has always seen itself as a Christian nation. And let me reiterate, that is a historical statement. That is not a statement about whether or not that's a right or wrong position, or whether or not those who believe they're living in a Christian nation are interpreting the founders correctly. Now, as a caveat, there, of course, are always going to be people who do not think we're living in a Christian nation, that we're living in a tolerant nation, a secular nation, a religiously diverse nation. I would argue that through the course of United States history, that is those people are in a significant minority position, as opposed to the larger mainstream culture. Point 2, the Bible. The Bible was absolutely essential to the vision of the founders during the Revolutionary era, their vision for a nation, I should say. The Bible was absolutely essential to the founders' vision for the nation and for the revolution as a whole. It played an important role. There is a political scientist at the University of Houston named Donald Lutz. He and his graduate students did a massive study of the writing of the Founding Fathers during the 1760s and 1770s and 1780s. And what they concluded was that the Founding Fathers cited the Bible more than any other book. Now, to be fair to that historical research, and from what I can understand, Lutz had no sort of political agenda when he did this research. He just concluded that amongst all the writings of the Founding Fathers, and I don't have time to get into how he defined that, but it was a significant group that he surveyed, the Bible was quoted more than any other book. Now, it depends how you look at this information. While the Bible was indeed the most cited book, other sources, Enlightenment sources, sources that we might call Whig, classical authors and sources, if you put them all together, they were cited twice as much as the Bible. But if you pick one particular book, the Bible would be on top. Nevertheless, the Bible indeed was important. Now, what fascinates me as a historian of American religion is how the Bible is employed and how the Bible is used in the revolutionary cause. Let me give you a little example here. Let's take a passage from the New Testament in the New Testament book of Galatians, chapter 5 and verse 1. Let me read you that passage. It is freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened by a yoke of slavery. This verse appears over and over again in the writings of patriotic ministers, but also even in some of the Founding Fathers. Now, I was intrigued by this, so I looked at the ways in which this verse has been interpreted by the history of the Christian church, all the way back to the ancient world, the early church. And, I'm generalizing here because I don't have much time, but largely the interpretation of this verse went something along these lines. It is freedom that Christ has set us free. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. In other words, we are bound by a yoke of slavery or a yoke of sin. We are sinners in need of redemption. Jesus Christ, through his sacrificial death, as Christians understand it, on the cross, redeemed us from the yoke of slavery, set us free. Jesus Christ is thus the great emancipator in some ways. And if you look through the course of religious history, Catholic and Protestant, I haven't checked Orthodox, but if you look at Catholic and Protestant, roughly this would be the way that this verse had been interpreted. In 1769, there was a minister by the name of Enoch Green who pastored a small Presbyterian church in New Jersey. And in 1769, he preached a sermon on Galatians 5:1. Reading the manuscript sermon and the notes that he took that he preached that day, he pretty much preached a message, an interpretation of Galatians 5 that was pretty consistent with the way in which the history of the Christian church has interpreted this. In other words, the way I just explained it. In 1776, 7 years later, Enoch Green preached on the same passage. Now, if we have any ministers or pastors in the room, or you know a pastor or minister or priest or something, you know that, a lot of ministers might say, okay, it's time to preach on this verse again. Let me go to the file and pull out my sermon on Galatians 5:1, and, I'll preach the same sermon. Hopefully people won't remember that. I preached it 7 years ago. That's not what Green does. Instead, Green offers a very different interpretation of Galatians 5:1 than the one he preached 7 years earlier, and the one in which conformed, the sermon that conformed to the teachings on this verse that were evident in the historic Christian church. He argues that the yoke of slavery is actually a metaphor in Galatians 5:1 for the British Empire. The yoke is actually unfair taxation. That's really what this verse means. And of course, the freedom that Christ has set us free, the freedom, is political liberty. Freedom from the tyranny of the British Empire. And Christ is a metaphor for the Continental Army who will set us free from this tyranny. Now, this is not an isolated case. There are minister after minister, and even a few of the more theologically trained founding fathers like Witherspoon and Roger Sherman from Connecticut and Samuel Adams from Boston. Yes, you can be a theologian and drink beer, Adams reminds us. These men are making similar leaps to make these scriptures fit with the political climate of the day, namely the resistance against British taxation. Now, I'm not a biblical scholar. I can't, with any kind of authority, tell you that that is a wrong interpretation of that passage. I have a hunch it could be maybe a wrong interpretation, but who knows, right? What I can tell you, though, is that these founders and Presbyterian and patriotic ministers used the Bible in an innovative way that had not been, this has not been the way this had been interpreted in thousand years prior, but they used it in an innovative way to make it connect with the cultural and political issues of the day and thus justify revolution. Now, if you're looking for the biblical, so they're clearly not biblical literalists. They're taking a very metaphorical interpretation of Scripture. If you're looking for the biblical literalists, by the way, it is the loyalists, most of them Anglican ministers, who take the Bible at face value. You know what the favorite passage for the Anglican ministers was a passage in Romans chapter 13, the New Testament book of Romans chapter 13, where Paul says, the Christian apostle Paul says, and think about this now in terms of the revolutionary crisis of the 1760s and 1770s. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, Romans 13 says. For there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power resisteth the ordinance of God. And they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. If you go on in that passage, Paul exhorts the Roman Christians to pay tribute, pay your taxes. If you're looking for a literal interpretation to say that the American Revolution is biblically wrong, this is a place you might go. So you have these Anglican ministers and loyalist pastors using the Bible as well, reading it in a quite literal fashion, and suggesting that the American Revolution, as one Anglican minister said, was, quote unquote, conceived in sin. So the Bible, certainly important. How the Bible is used makes the story a little more interesting and complex. Third, the United States Constitution is godless. But 12 of the 13 state constitutions are not. Let me explain what I mean about this here, because this may rattle some people's feathers. Religion is mentioned twice in the United States Constitution. In Article 6, the famous test oath, no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. Of course, we are all familiar with the First Amendment. Congress shall make no laws respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The United States Constitution, as I mentioned before, does not endorse a particular religion. Anybody can serve in the federal government. You will not be discriminated against based upon your religion and so forth. Now compare the United States Constitution with the Constitution of the state of Vermont. And I picked Vermont for some interesting reasons. Especially because today Vermont, I love irony, and one of the things I love about history is irony. Today Vermont obviously being this sort of strong bastion of kind of secularism, Howard Dean, first state to endorse gay marriage and so forth. Here's the 1777 Constitution of the independent state of Vermont. Vermont becomes a state in 1791, and the Constitution then does not change on this point. It says this, or I don't want to quote, I'll quote actually from the book. The Constitution affirmed a natural right to worship Almighty God, as long as that worship was, quote unquote, regulated by the Word of God. Freedom of religion was offered to the people of Vermont as a civil right, afforded only to those who, quote unquote, profess the Protestant religion. The Constitution of Vermont also noted that, quote, every sect or denomination of people ought to observe the Sabbath, or the Lord's Day, and keep up, support some sort of religious worship, which to them shall seem most regrettable to the revealed will of God, agreeable, I should say, to the revealed will of God. All members of the Vermont government needed to affirm a belief in God as the creator and governor of the universe, the rewarder of the good and the punisher of the wicked. And in addition, any civil servant in Vermont had to testify to a belief in the divine inspiration of the Old and New Testaments and also profess the Protestant religion. Clearly, the Constitution of Vermont violates everything in the United States Constitution, because it says you can't put these qualifications on people to run for office. You can't endorse the Protestant religion. I'll make a point about this in a second. Let's look at my home state, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, obviously known for its religious toleration and freedom under its founder and proprietor, William Penn. The Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776 is the most democratic constitution of any of the new constitutions founded after the Revolution. There is a one-house legislature in Pennsylvania, and there is no executive branch, which means that the people are going to decide things. There's no checks and balances. The two houses of the legislature are not able to check anybody because there's only one. It's the people who make the decisions. Very democratic. Democratic before its time, even. But when it comes to religion, listen to Pennsylvania, the same constitution. Civil rights are afforded to anyone who, quote unquote, acknowledges the being of a God. If you want to serve in the legislature in Pennsylvania, you are required by law to subscribe to a belief in a God who creates and governs the world, rewards the good and punishes the wicked, and you must uphold a belief in the divine inspiration of the Old and New Testaments. You will find in one form or another these kinds of qualifications for office holding and for civil rights in 12 of the 13 former colonies, now states, some more blatant than others. Even Rhode Island, which is a state that is, because of the founder, Roger Williams, which was committed to religious freedom, still levies a tax to support religion. Government is involved in promoting religion through taxation. What is the big exception? Virginia. And I'm assuming some of you know the story behind this, but this is obviously where we connect directly to the theme of the night, the Virginia Statute of Religious Liberty. But in Virginia, of course, you have this incredible showdown between Patrick Henry, who promotes this idea of a general assessment of religion. A general assessment bill, or as it was officially called, a bill for establishing a provision for teachers of the Christian religion. What Henry wanted, after the Anglican Church is removed as the established church, right? How are we going to now think about religion and the state? Henry wants a tax to be collected that will be then distributed equally among all the Protestant groups in Virginia. So the sheriff comes to your house, collects your tax money. You fill out a form as to where you want the money to go. If you're a Baptist, you can support your Baptist preacher. If you don't have a religion, or if you are Catholic or a non-Protestant, your money goes to help the poor and to poor relief. In other words, Henry believes that the government must be involved in sponsoring religion, promoting it in some way, shape, or form. Not in a sort of tyrannical Anglican church that persecutes anyone who's not Anglican, but in a sort of general kind of assessment. Of course, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson have very different views. Madison, in response to Henry's general assessment, writes his famous memorial and remonstrance against religious assessments, and manages to garner great support from the ordinary people of Virginia. Again, another great irony here. Guess who supports Madison and later Jefferson, who will author the Statute of Religious Freedom? It is largely evangelical Christians, Baptists and Presbyterians, and a rising sect known as the Methodists, who are tired of being persecuted under a state-sponsored Anglican church as they were throughout the entire colonial period. So what do? They rally behind Thomas Jefferson, a man who is somewhat skeptical about religion. Talk about strange bedfellows. Jefferson, who's close to being a deist, someone who doesn't believe in a supernatural God, teams up with all these devout evangelicals to get the statute for religious freedom passed. I often bring this up because there are many Virginia Baptists today, many who were involved with this quadricentennial celebration of Jamestown. Some of them find themselves surrounding the town of Lynchburg, Virginia, who would argue that there is no separation of church and state. It's a myth. Well, they're okay to argue that. It's a free country. But if they do argue that, especially these Baptists on the Christian right, they have to admit that they're violating the entire history of Baptists in Virginia, who have always been defenders of the separation of church and state. Of course, the final result is the Statute of Religious Freedom, and you can read that in your program to see how this all turned out. So what is my point here? In some ways, those who want to argue that religion was something that had to be decided by the individual states, those who argue this, and many on the Christian right, Christian nationalists do argue this, they have a point. They have a point that at least 12 of the 13 states did have clear Christian qualifications for office. The writers of these constitutions, many of them who also served in the National Constitutional Convention and in the Continental Congress, believed that government at a local level should be run by Christians. Now, the problem is, we also had a 14th Amendment in the 1860s, which required that the states abide by the First Amendment. So it no longer works today. And there's, I think, one of the flaws in the sort of Christian nationalist position, but we can maybe get to that during the question and answer session. But the point being, the Constitution is godless. If you read the 10th Amendment, it clearly states that whatever is not covered in this Constitution will be covered among the states. This is often referred to as a federalist view of the Constitution. And at least prior to the Civil War, this was the way in which it was understood. This is why, say, the state of Massachusetts could have a religious establishment, taxpayer money going to support the Congregational Church until 1833, 60-some years after the Constitution is ratified, because this religious issue would be a state issue. Point 4. This will be a little shorter than the last two. The Founding Fathers almost universally, I would say universally, let's take the almost out, championed religious freedom. Let's take George Washington, for example, a president who was deeply committed to religious freedom. Not religious toleration, but religious freedom. Toleration, of course, means we don't like you, but we'll tolerate you anyway and let you worship the way you want. Religious freedom implies that all churches, synagogues, religious groups are allowed to worship freely without any type of government coercion. Washington, when he was president, wrote letters, public letters, defending the religious freedom of Protestants, Catholics, Jews, in a very famous letter to the congregation in Newport, Rhode Island. Even this sort of small little sect known as the Swedenborgians, which were very popular in the Middle Atlantic, received a letter from George Washington reminding them that their religious freedom would be protected. Jefferson, Washington, Madison, Franklin, Adams, Witherspoon, Samuel Adams, John Jay, Patrick Henry, all of these groups upheld, all these men, I should say, upheld a belief in religious freedom, as long as that religious freedom was in the bounds of the law. Now, think about what I just said on the last point. Just because you uphold religious freedom doesn't necessarily mean that in a particular state, people from, say, in Vermont, that a Catholic can run for office, or a Jew can run for office in Pennsylvania. Certainly, they are free to worship in the way that they want to worship. But because of these stipulations in these early constitutions, they are not allowed to hold political office, because in most of the states, with the exception of Virginia, those offices are to be given over to people either of the Protestant faith, the Christian faith, someone who can uphold the divine inspiration of the Old and New Testament, and so forth. So political liberty and religious freedom are sort of two different things here. Nevertheless, the founders championed religious freedom. And then finally, I said I'd give you 6. How about 5? All of the founding fathers universally believed that Christianity was good for the American Republic. Now, here's where we sometimes get caught up. Just because a founding father believed certain things in their own personal lives, whether they were Christians, not Christians, deists, unorthodox, believed in the resurrection of Jesus Christ or didn't, really is not a very good barometer for how they thought about the role that religion should play in society. So you have someone like Thomas Jefferson, who rejected the resurrection of Jesus Christ, rejected the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, rejected the inspiration of the Bible. You have someone like Jefferson who still believes that religion can be a positive force, and even particularly Christianity can be a positive force in society. Now, the founders were not particularly clear on how it would be a positive force. In other words, they weren't specific. They didn't say, we should always allow prayer in schools, or we should always allow manger scenes in front of City Hall. Here we don't, they're unclear. We can't draw on the specifics. But they did believe that in some shape or form, religion was essential to a good republic. Remember, these men were steeped in classical learning. They understood that in order for a republic to survive, citizens needed to be willing at times to sacrifice their own interests for the greater good of the republic. In the 18th century, they called this virtue. Again, we tend to think of virtue today through a sort of Victorian lens, right? The virtuous woman who is chaste and so forth. That's a very Victorian sort of gendered understanding of virtue. In the 18th century, virtue was also very driven by gender, but it was a masculine idea. It was a political idea. People who were virtuous were willing to put down their own interests for the greater good of the republic. And most of the founders believed that the best candidates for this type of virtue were Christians, or generally religious people. In a great letter, a great piece that he writes in 1785, Benjamin Rush, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, Philadelphia physician, says that we should be teaching religion in the schools, in public schools, which he was advocating for. I don't care what religion it is, he said. It could be the religion of Confucius. It could be the religion of Muhammad. Whatever religion produces citizens that are willing to sacrifice their own interests for something greater, I will support. Now, to be fair to that record, he does then go on to say, but of course, the best example of this is the teachings of Jesus Christ. Again, that's just what Rush says. But the point is, many of the founders believed that if a religion created a good citizen, religion was not important to them for how, for the best way to get to heaven or how to please God. They really didn't care about that. If they did, they didn't talk about it publicly. These men were statesmen. They were building a republic. And if religion helped them to build that republic, it was useful to them, regardless of what their own convictions were. So personal beliefs of the founders, you hear this all the time in the news media. You hear, well, all the founders were deists, or all the founders were Christians, or all the founders were something. That doesn't matter to this question of whether or not these people were trying to create a Christian nation, as much as what they believed about the role of religion and its relationship to the good of the republic. So Christianity, the founders believed, was good for the republic. In closing, I want to call your attention to something I witnessed in 2010 while watching political commentator Glenn Beck's now canceled television show. In this particular episode, Beck devoted the entire show to George Whitefield, the 18th century evangelical revivalist and the precipitator of the event known as the First Great Awakening. Near the end of the show, Beck's conversation with his guests, two fairly reputable early American religious historians, turned to the topic of slavery. Beck wondered how Whitefield could inspire anti-slavery advocates in England, such as John Newton. Some of you are familiar with Newton, the author of the hymn Amazing Grace. How could he inspire Newton while at the same time Whitefield owned slaves? Befuddled by this paradox, and clearly at a loss for words, which as you know is unusual for Glenn Beck, Beck turned to the camera and said this: "Sometimes history is a little complex." It shocked me when he said it. Though Beck's use of history in his television and radio programs seldom reflects this kind of complexity, in this particular case, he was absolutely right. History is complex. It is the responsibility of the historian to make every effort to explain the past in all its fullness. To do otherwise is not only to cease to be a historian, but to fail to act with integrity in interpreting the complexity of human activity in the world. Such a lesson applies to those who doggedly defend the notion that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, and those who doggedly defend the notion that the United States was founded as a secular nation. I've been pretty hard on the Christian nationalists in this lecture. I can point to you to people on the political left who are also trying to indoctrinate us through historical example. In a soundbite culture where public figures appeal to the past to score political points or advance a particular cultural or religious agenda, it is my hope that we would all think more deeply about the role that Christianity played and did not play in the American founding. We owe it to ourselves to be informed citizens who can speak intelligently and thoughtfully about our nation's past. Thank you. I believe I'm taking some questions, right? Are there instructions here?
No instructions.
We have a mic, so if you can raise your hand, we can get the mic to you and fire away.
I'd just like to ask you, what do you think of the following two propositions in reference to what you said? The first being not that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, but it was founded as a very narrow view of what a Christian nation should be.
Yeah.
And I mean, you can see that from the references you made yourself, because certainly a believer in Islam would have fit all the criteria you describe about believing the Bible was divinely inspired, believing in God and so on. But nobody ever contemplated an Islamic person as a possible candidate for public office at the time. The second thing I wanted you to think about was, despite what the statutes or constitutions might have provided in a formal way, the real bar to participation in public life and basic social mobility in this country based on religion, or was not anything that was enshrined in law, but more enshrined in the culture of the time, in the context of prejudices, judgments, biases from the way the Catholic Church had acted in Europe prior to the founding of the U.S. Could you just tell me what you think of those two ideas?
Yeah, let me try to synthesize both of them, because I think you're getting at the similar things with both questions. I think what you're really trying to get at is how do we specifically define Christian if we're going to call ourselves a Christian nation. The first question you ask about Islam, I mean, we have to draw boundaries somewhere. I'm drawing a boundary that's saying someone who is a Muslim is not a Christian. I'm just, I have to draw a boundary there somewhere. I can't, and that's how they would have understood it in the 18th century. So I'm not quite sure what you're getting at with the first point, but clearly, if you want to say that this is a narrow view of Christianity, I think you could have a sort of broader view of Christianity too, and still exclude Muslims. Again, I'm talking here as a historian of the 18th century. The second question was related to, I'm blanking here. The cultural sort of Christianity. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to define Christian nation. I mean, there's some who want to say, well, if God is not recognized in the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence, then we're not a Christian nation. There's others who want to emphasize what I call in the book orthopraxy. Can we truly say that a Christian nation, can a nation truly be Christian if it upholds the institution of slavery or the way it's treated Native Americans and so forth? There is another way in which I would argue that the United States, and this is what I was trying to get at a little bit with my first point, that culturally, the United States has always been understood itself as a Christian nation. And there you would just, you could look at that demographically in terms of the fact that Christianity, Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox, are by far the largest religious denomination. But also culturally, I mean, one of the things the Christian nationalists like David Barton and others love to do is they love to take people to Washington, D.C. and show them the Capitol and so forth, where all of these statements, "In God we trust," and references to the Bible and images in the Capitol of the Pilgrims landing and so forth. They're tapping into a Christian culture that I would say for most of the 19th century was not only a dominantly Christian culture, it was not only a dominantly Protestant culture, but I would even say it was a dominantly evangelical Protestant culture. In terms of the number of people, and this is especially the case before the Civil War, maybe than after, but this ethos of Christianity, of course, pervades our culture and always has. Those who have, as I said in the lecture, those who have resisted this culture, whether it be Catholics in the 1840s and 50s, Irish Catholics, whether it be Jews, whether it be, the various different world religions that Americans were introduced to in the 1893 World Parliament of Religions in Chicago at the World's Fair, all of these groups, from all the way up to the World War II, were cultural minorities who had to, who part of their process of assimilation as the Protestant powers that be understood it, part of their process of assimilation, as it was understood, was to somehow assimilate to this Protestant or maybe even evangelical culture. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but these are different ways of defining what it means to be a Christian nation.
Let's say one more question. Oh, it's not a religious question, but I was wondering if you could explain George Washington's views on political parties, because I've heard he was a Federalist, but he didn't like political parties.
Yeah, you're right. It's not related to the lecture, but I'll give it a quick shot. George Washington was a Federalist. He was someone who was clearly linked to a view of American politics that glorified Britain, that glorified a strong central government. He would have thought the Tea Party was a strange thing. He was for a strong and powerful central government. It was Thomas Jefferson who was the libertarian. Thomas Jefferson, the religious skeptic, was the libertarian, right? But in his, and he could also be very self-interested, economically self-interested. We have this idea of Washington as being a very virtuous person above all of the nastiness of everyday life, right? He sort of rose above it. I mean, this guy had his investments. When he invaded the whiskey rebels in western Pennsylvania, a lot of these whiskey rebels were people who were squatting on his own land. You talk about a conflict of interest. You use the army to go out there to drive people off your land. I'm not here to degrade Washington, but the point was he always did say, and to be fair to him, he always did his best to sort of rise above these political squabbles that were racking his administration in the 1790s. I mean, could you imagine an administration today in which, your Secretary of State and your Secretary of War are forming its own political party in resistance to you while you're sitting in, and then 2 minutes later go to a cabinet meeting? So it's a very different political culture in the 1790s. Washington feared political parties largely because of this Republican virtuous idea. What is a political party? The founders understood a political party as a bunch of people who had self-interest, right? Who were selfish in some regards, and hey, I have this self-interest, and hey, I have the same self-interest. Let's get together. Self-interest destroys the common good, destroys the republic. So a community of self-interested people can only, force the republic to deteriorate. The founders like to quote the book of Judges in the Old Testament a lot. Each man does what is right in his or her own eyes. That's a very dangerous thing if you want a republic to survive, as the founders would have understood it in the 18th century.
Would you agree that America is a Christian nation because it was largely founded by people who left other countries where they practiced Christianity and came here so they could practice their religion in a free way without being in a place where they had an established religion in the country where they lived?
I mean, I assume you're saying that they could practice their religion, meaning
whether they were
non-Anglican or non-state church kind of.
Exactly, non-state church, right?
Yeah.
And they wanted to go to a place where they could practice theirs, and they all went to different places where they could practice theirs, and those became the colonies.
Well, I mean, I would say there's some truth to that. I mean, certainly I'd much rather sort of call this a nation, of religious liberty than a nation of Christian America. But religious liberty, as defined in the 18th century, as I've already suggested, was very limited in the way it would be understood today. It was very limited in certain places to Protestants and so forth. Also, depending on the region, I think people went to Pennsylvania. I think people went to Pennsylvania to experience legitimate religious liberty within the context of Christianity. Although Jews were worshiping in Penn's colony as well by the end of the 17th century. I think people went to New England for a certain form of religious liberty. New England, the Puritan colonies, though, became a place in which you were free, religiously free. You were religiously free to conform to the Puritans' view of what religion was, or else you were asked to leave and go found Rhode Island or something.
I was going to follow up and say they thought that their states could be, the Quaker state or the Puritan state, but they thought that their country was not a country of any one religion or even Protestantism. I mean, even the Virginia statute mentions, Muslims and Jews and which were in a very, very small minority. So most of them were Christians. They saw themselves as Christians and their states as Christian states.
Yeah, I would.
But did they see that? Does that mean they saw their nation as a Christian nation?
Well,
That's
again,
my
what is a
question.
nation? I mean, we're talking about these people coming over in the 1620s and 30s, and then we're talking about 150 years later when they're forming a nation. There's a difference between the sort of planting of the colonies, I argue, and the sort of founding of the nation. So it's a little more complicated than that, but certainly, they wanted a nation in which their dissenting religions would be respected and they'd be able to worship freely. They would not have used the term, we're a Christian nation, at the time. They would have understood this as a place in which Christianity is respected, but also other faiths were, at least officially, other faiths were respected as well. Culturally, as this first question was asked, that's a whole different story.
Since the Constitution says that treaties are the supreme law of the land, and since the Treaty of Tripoli explicitly states that the United States is not in any sense a Christian nation,
Yeah.
doesn't that make the question that's basically the title of this talk, doesn't that make that answering that in the negative trivial thing to do?
I was waiting for the Treaty of Tripoli question, and it's a good one. It's a good one. Here's my take on the Treaty of Tripoli. Let me catch you, those of you who aren't familiar, let me give you a quick 30-second, hopefully, synopsis. In the 1790s, the United States government made a treaty with the Muslim nation of Tripoli. The Muslim pirates in the Mediterranean Sea were raiding American ships. The British had protected them before the revolution. Now that the revolution was over, they no longer had protection of the British Navy. So they were on their own, and these pirates were sticking it to them on the high seas. Basically, the United States government decided to negotiate with terrorists, and they decided to make a treaty with these, basically pay them money so that they would stop sinking American ships. And that's what the treaty was. Embedded within the treaty is the following statement, and I'm probably going to get this wrong. I'm not going to quote it verbatim, but it's something like, the United States is not or has never been a Christian nation. And that's what's mentioned in the treaty. The treaty passed unanimously in both houses, and it was endorsed by the President of the United States, John Adams. Those who want to suggest that America was not founded as a Christian nation, this is a very important arrow in their quiver, so to speak, an important part of their arsenal. I would argue that there are other ways to argue that America was not founded as a Christian nation than to use the Treaty of Tripoli. Simply because I argue, and this is how I actually start the first chapter of this book, simply because this was a diplomatic treaty in which the United States government wanted to be clear that this was not going to be a religious war between these two. It was more of an economic treaty between the nation of Tripoli. They just wanted the protection of their ships, and as a result, they said, we are not going to turn this into a holy war. We are not a Christian nation. We are not trying to we're not in the Mediterranean to try to endorse our beliefs or convert you to Christianity, but we do want our neutral shipping rights to be respected. It's open for interpretation. My interpretation is that this was a treaty, a diplomatic document, and the reference to America not being a Christian nation must be understood within that context of what kind of document this is. So I'll leave it at that. That's my take on it. I would say, if you want to argue that America is not a Christian nation, I don't think the Treaty of Tripoli, because of the context in which it was written and the nature of that document, is particularly going to help your argument or strengthen your argument. We could debate it after the talk if you want, but that's at least my take on it.
What was the role of the Masonic Lodge within the definition of a Christian nation?
Yeah, good question. And if there's one thing I regret in writing this book was that I didn't have something about the Freemasons in it, because many of these founding fathers were Freemasons. The Freemasons in the 18th century was what we might call a sort of benevolent society, a society of distinguished and wealthy and educated men, whether formally or informally. Ben Franklin never had a formal education. He was a Mason, who met together for the purpose of improving themselves, self-improvement through sort of, sharpening one another by discussing great ideas, but also then promoting a good, moral, benevolent society around them, making the world a better place. In this sense, they wanted to make the world a better place on Enlightenment terms, not on Christian terms. They thought that embedded within the 18th century Enlightenment in the West was the notion of progress, We need to improve society. We need to build better roads. We need to make people more moral. We need to teach people how to read. We need to open up libraries. All of these kinds of things. You didn't have to be a Christian or identify with Christian faith in any way, shape, or form to endorse those kinds of things. This was a morality that was really driven in the common conscience or moral sense, as the Scottish philosophers called it, that all of us have, rather than in an infusion of divine grace into your life. You know, as say the 18th century theologian Jonathan Edwards would have said, you know, the only way you can truly do good, Edwards said, was to be converted, you know, to have a conversion experience. The Masons said, no, we're going to do good in society based on our sort of common morality. So there was no, and there was no tension. As there would have been later in the 19th century, there was no tension between upholding Christianity and being a Freemason. So, you know, for people like Ben Franklin and Jefferson, who were both, Thomas Jefferson, who were both Freemasons, this fit perfectly with their enlightened view of the world. You know, both Franklin and Jefferson were very moral individuals. They thought morality was absolutely essential. This is why Jefferson cut up the New Testament. All the supernatural parts he took out, but he loved the moral teachings of Jesus. So the Freemasons fit perfectly with that kind of promotion of morality, you know, this sort of moral, uplifting the moral nature of society. But you could be a Christian and still believe that. So there was no incompatibility between being a Christian and being a Mormon. I've been watching too many GOP, a Freemason. Now, later on in the 19th century, evangelicals would challenge Freemasonry because of their secret symbols and what they believed were satanic, images and so forth, but not in the 18th century in the founders.
When George Washington was sworn in as president for the first time, it's my understanding that they had a hard time. Somebody insisted that he be sworn in on a Bible. Mm-hmm. They had a hard time finding one. I think they got it from the Masons. And George Washington took the oath and kissed the Bible, as I understand it. Mm-hmm. I think Chernow said that in his book.
I'm sorry, who?
Chernow, was it?
Yeah, I'm not. Oh, Ron Chernow. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. I'm just wondering if you think that George Washington, in taking the oath in that manner, was doing that as a Christian?
Yeah.
Your comment.
Yeah, it's a great question. I thought you were actually going to go a different direction about whether he swore the oath said under God. He swore an oath to God. The Bible. Swearing an oath on the Bible, whether it be the President of the United States or a member of Parliament, was a common thing in most of what we might call the Anglo-American world, Britain, the colonies, and so forth. So the fact that George Washington put his hand on a Bible, I don't think would necessarily make the United States then some kind of uniquely Christian nation that celebrates the Bible, simply because they did it in England too, and England saw themselves as a Christian, Christian nation. How does that reflect George Washington's faith? I'm not sure we can draw much about George Washington's personal faith based upon the fact that he stuck his hand on the Bible, since it was such a customary thing to do. As long as we're here, Jefferson's a very elusive character, or Washington rather, is a very elusive character to figure out his faith. Any sort of personal sentiments that he would have expressed about this, which many historians think he may have when he wrote his letters, his letters to Martha. Martha burned them all on George's orders after George died because he didn't want anyone to know his interior life. Washington was a man who was a churchgoer. He was a church leader. He was a vestryman in his church. Seldom took communion, which could be a marker of his commitment or lack thereof. But very, very difficult to nail down in terms of culturally, in terms of the culture of Virginia Anglicanism, he was certainly a Christian. He was born within the Anglican Church. He was baptized. He had an Anglican ceremony at his death and so forth. But I don't think it's helpful to make an argument about Washington's faith one way or the other based upon the fact that he swore on a Bible. I think it was just a cultural thing.
In contrast to that, what of the presidents who didn't swear in on the Bible? I know several swore on a book of law instead.
Yeah, there you're getting outside of my sort of area of expertise. I mean, none of the founders. I always tell my students anything after 1800 for me is current events, not history. But I don't know. Do you have a president in mind? I don't even know who they were. Did John? I think John did. I'm not sure. My guess would be John swore on the Bible. Yeah, I'm not sure. John Quincy was much more devout than his father. Matter of fact, John Adams couldn't figure out John Quincy Adams' sort of evangelicalism at that point. He writes him these letters like, what is your, you believe in the Trinity? But I don't know. I honestly don't know the answer to that question. I'm curious now, though. I'd like to figure out, which one. I was unaware any of the early presidents did not swear on a Bible, but I could be wrong. I just don't know. I plead ignorance.
Well, on that note of doubt, please join me again in thanking John Fia
Yeah.
for his time.
Thank you very much.
And thank you.